Curious about the different ways I can get to my virtual machines in virtual networks in Azure? In this video, we're going to explore the different options. I've had a number of people contacting me kind of confused about what's the right way to connect to resources in Azure. There are a number of different options available. There's technologies like JIT, like Bastion, and which one should people be using? Now, the first thing I would say, remember, if I have servers deployed in Azure, just like in a data center, typically we shouldn't be connecting to the console of those machines. I don't want to be RDPing or SSH directly into those machines. We want to think more about remote management. I have a certain tool set locally on my machine, and then that will still require a certain port to go and do management operations. But we really want to try and reduce the times we are RDPing or SSHing directly onto servers. We want to try and minimize that. But that being said, it's still going to happen. How do we connect to things? Now, if we take a step back for a second, if we think about Azure, I have a subscription. Now, that subscription is going to be for a certain cloud, often the commercial cloud. There are other clouds as well. But within that commercial cloud, there are lots of Azure regions. So I can think about there's all these different regions all throughout the world. And I can pretty much use any of those. So I have my subscription, and within that subscription, I have access to all those different regions. And we're just going to pick on one of those regions in particular. So there's a certain region I want to deploy resources to. Now, the first thing I need is a resource group, and then I need a virtual network. When I'm deploying things like virtual machines or containers or other types of service, they deploy into a virtual network. Now, some other Azure services don't. They don't require that integration with a virtual network. I still might be able to interact with them from the virtual network. I might even be able to project that service into a virtual network through things like Private Link. But if I think about virtual machines, containers, they're going to integrate into a virtual network. So within a certain subscription and within a certain region, that's where a virtual network lives. It can't span regions, it can't span subscriptions. So within a certain region, so this is a particular region, within a particular subscription, I can go ahead and create a virtual network. So a virtual network is one or more IP spaces. We often think about the RFC 1918, the 10 dot, the 172.16, the 192.168. It doesn't have to be. Just those IP address spaces are typically used because they're non-routable on the internet. I can safely use them on an internal network. I'm not going to clash with some internet-based resource. So I have a virtual network. I give it one or more IP spaces. So I can have multiple spaces. I could have this virtual network has a 10 dot space. It could have some elements for 172.16. I can have multiple spaces within that virtual network. I then break that virtual network up into virtual subnets. So I could have subnet 1, subnet 2, etc. And each subnet is a portion of the IP space of the virtual network. Now I then create resources. So let's say, for example, I'm going to go ahead and I create, what's going on now? I create a virtual machine. So the virtual machine has to be in the same region as the virtual network. I'm not going to try and create a VM in a region over here and connect to a VNet over here. It wouldn't work. Now that virtual machine has a number of different aspects it can use. It has various resources of its own. It has disks and it has a network adapter. So this virtual machine also has a virtual NIC. And I can connect that NIC to a subnet. So the NIC is a discrete resource. The VM is a discrete resource. I connect the NIC to the VM and I attach the NIC into a particular subnet. Now, the reality is I can have multiple NICs on a virtual machine. Each NIC could connect to different subnets in the same virtual network. I can even have multiple IP addresses. For a single NIC, there are multiple IP configurations possible. But for now, we're going to ignore all of that. We're just going to say, hey, look, I have a virtual machine. I have a NIC. That NIC attaches to a subnet in a virtual network. Now, what happens when I do that is that NIC gets an IP address dynamically assigned from the IP address space of the subnet it's attached to. So it kind of gets a dynamic IP. Sometimes you will see DIP. You might see virtual IP, there's different kind of names, but this is a dynamically assigned IP address from the IP space of the subnet. So the OS is configured to use DHCP. It's going to say, hey, I need an IP address, and it's going to get one. It's going to get its dynamic IP. Now, if I need it to always get the same IP, at the Azure Fabric level, I can kind of do a DHCP reservation. I can say, hey, look, this NIC always needs to get this IP address. Even if that VM has been deprovisioned and then it started back up again, I don't want it to get a different IP. Maybe it's a SQL server, it's a domain controller. It always needs to get the same IP address. So I can configure that. Now this IP address, I'm actually just going to say IP to not confuse things. This is like a private IP. This is internal to this virtual network because it comes from the IP space. This is not a public-facing IP address. Yes, the VM can get to the internet because just by default, virtual networks provide kind of that NAT gateway. So I can do an outbound request to the internet and get a response. But from the internet, I can't just go and connect to that IP. Same way in our offices at work, we have an IP address. If you did an IP config or an IF config in Linux, you'll see it's probably a 10 dot or 172.16 or 192 something. That's from that RFC 1918, it's internal use only. It's the same as, hey, my office number is 22. That means something within my office, but someone out on the street can't send a letter to office 22. It's meaningless. It won't route on the postal system. So I have this internal IP. Now, other resources that are in the same virtual network can communicate to that IP address. So I'm just going to draw them within the subnets. It's not, again, that's not how it works. It has a network interface card connected, but if I had another VM, if I had another VM in this subnet, well, it can talk to that VM via the NIC. If I had VMs in other subnets, they can all talk to each other. Azure automatically provides that kind of gateway, so they can all talk. So if I think about, hey, I have a resource in Azure and I want to connect to it, be it RDP, be it SSH, be it management traffic. I'm doing 5986 for WinOM. They can all communicate with each other because they're on the same virtual network. So they can automatically all talk over pretty much any protocol. If I had a different virtual network, but I had peered it, then that connectivity is going to expand. Now, it'd have to be using its own unique set of IP spaces. They couldn't conflict. But now if I had a VM in a subnet over here, well, that could go and talk. If I had a VNet over here and I peered it, so I can do global peering, and I had a VM, that could talk. So I think about getting to resources. If I'm in another resource in Azure, be it on the same virtual network or a different virtual network that has peering, I can most likely, now I'm saying most likely, because we have a concept called network security groups I'm going to get to in a second, I can restrict that flow. But let's assume I haven't, I've just got kind of the defaults. I'll be able to get to resources on any network I'm connected to. Now I'm saying network peering, that's generally the best option today. In the past, we also might have used a site-to-site VPN between virtual networks. We might have connected them to the same express route circuit. Then that traffic would have kind of hairpinned from the network service provider. But today, if I want to connect virtual networks together, typically we're just going to use the peering option. So that's great. If I'm in Azure, chances are I can just directly talk to the resource. But what about if I'm not? what about if I'm kind of on premises and I've kind of got my machine here and I want to get to my resource in Azure. Now I just mentioned ExpressRoute. And ExpressRoute is a phenomenal technology. Think of ExpressRoute as essentially, I have the Microsoft network. So this is the Microsoft backbone in a way. And every region has kind of redundant connections into that backbone. So with ExpressRoute, what happens is Microsoft have extended their network into some meet me location, a network service provider. And here I then have connections into that network service provider, either direct, or it could be like an MPLS, something else. There's a cross connect happens in the middle. And now I essentially have connected my network to the Microsoft network backbone. And then if over that connection, we introduce something called private peering. So this is private peering. That's when I connect my network into a virtual network via ExpressRoute. I would now be able to get to those machines. And also if I've connected it a certain way, if I enable gateway transit, I'll be able to get to resources in other VNets that appear to this one. This has the gateway, these have got transit routing. Hey, I'll be able to get to these as well through my ExpressRoute. I could do a site-to-site VPN from my location directly into that virtual network. I'd then be able to get to them all using that private IP. So there's no public IPs yet. None of that is here. This is all private IP. So I can either, from within Azure, get to the private IP directly, because I'm on the Azure network, be it that VNet or a peered one, or from on-premises if I have a site-to-site VPN, or if I'm using ExpressRoute and I have private peering. Now, if I'm a machine just kind of sitting out here, and I'm not on my corporate network, but it has ExpressRoute, I could do a VPN to my corporate network and then get to it. Or I can enable point-to-site VPN on a virtual network. So then I could actually, just for my machine, establish a point-to-site connection. So all of these slew of options is all using the private IP. There's no public-facing endpoint on this resource. And all these different conditions are satisfied. But what about if I need to access it from a public endpoint? What about if all of these either aren't available or is not an option for me? So let's just scroll over for a second. And we can tidy up the picture a little bit. So once again, I'm still kind of in that region. And we have our virtual network. And I'm just going to kind of draw our resource in there. And remember, it has that private IP. One option, I'm not saying this is a good option, is in addition to the private IP, well, I can actually give it a public IP as well. So I can actually add to the configuration, I'm just going to also give it a public IP. Now the VM doesn't really see that public IP. What's really happening now is that traffic that comes to the public IP, the Azure Fabric, will forward the traffic through to the virtual machine. That is now an IP address that's on the public, the internet routable space. So now, absolutely, and we do this sometimes. Maybe I'm advertising 443, I have some web presence available to me. But I could also, and we're not saying we're going to do this at all, I could also expose 3389. I could say, hey, so 3389, that's RDP. I'm going to expose that to the internet. So now what I could do is, hey, look, I'm sitting over here just on the internet. I could go and connect to that port and log in. Great. So can everyone else in the world. And you're hacked in seconds. Well, maybe not seconds, you've got good password, but that thing is just going to get attacked. I don't want to just open a front door to log on to my service to the internet. So this is generally not something we want to do. Very rarely do we want to just expose virtual machines out to the internet. We kind of like this internal approach first. Hey, let's make it internally available. But what if I do? I do want to make it externally available. I want to access it via a public IP address. One of the things I mentioned before was called network security groups, NSGs. And they're actually always at play. So even here in this picture, most of the time, you're actually going to have, in orange, you're going to have a network security group applied at a subnet level. So each subnet, I have an NSG applied. I can also apply them directly to NICs. It's hard to manage. I'm not saying you can't do it, it's just very hard to manage. Now the reality is network security groups is not an edge device. It is not some device sitting at the edge at the gateway that's tracking the traffic as it comes in. An NSG is actually enforced at the NIC level. So I'm applying it to the subnet from a management perspective, but the reality is it's actually enforced at the NIC. Now, what is a network security group? If I jump over super quickly, and I'm just going to quickly look at a network security group. So here you can see what it's actually showing me is a number of the default rules. And what we can kind of see here is, well, there's some inbound rules and there's some outbound rules. So this is without any changes. So if I actually go to inbound security rules specifically, if I hide default rules, you'll see I don't have any. Same for the outbound. If I hide the default rules, I don't have any. But if I go back to those inbound rules, we can see, well, it's got a priority. The lower the number, the higher the priority. So a priority of 1 would be absolute. That's the highest possible priority. So these default rules actually have a very low priority. So I can easily add things that are more important, that would take precedence. So we can see the first rule allows VNet inbound. So it's any port, any protocol. The source is virtual network. The destination is virtual network. My action is to allow. So that's basically saying, hey, any traffic within the virtual network can flow. And virtual network, the name doesn't exactly mean what it says. It doesn't mean just that virtual network. It's any network connected to that virtual network. So if I had a peered network, if I was connecting via ExpressRoute, that would be within the virtual network as well. It's a known IP space. So this virtual network is a service tag. You'll see there's another rule that says, hey, let the Azure load balancer talk to things. Everything else is denied. So that would mean coming from the internet is denied. So even if I gave a virtual machine a public IP, by default, nothing's getting through because it's denied. I would actually have to go and add a rule. In my case, that terrible rule would say, hey, from the internet, allow 3389 so I can RDP. We wouldn't want to do that, but technically we could. Now, when we have our NSG rules, they're actually made up of where's it coming from. So this can be an IP range. It can be an application security group. Think of an application security group as a tag. It could be SQL, could be IIS. It's a type of workload. Or it can be a service tag. So service tag, there are some key ones like internet. That's the non-virtual network known IP space. It could be the Azure load balancer. There's a ton of other services. So this is how I can control access to other Azure services. Globally, any instance of this, or then we break down into region specific. Hey, storage in each particular region. So I can be super granular in where it's coming from, where it's going to, the protocol, whether to allow it, and then the priority. So those network security groups are super powerful. So if we go back to our whiteboard, when I think about then, hey, if I'm going to give it a public IP, what I could absolutely do is I could have an NSG, and that NSG I could kind of say, hey, if it's from the internet, it has to be IP, my IP address at home, for example. Let's say it doesn't change, I could put that in there. and then the destination could be that particular IP address of the virtual machine. So I could restrict it. So that's one approach, and that would be the minimum you would do. But I'm still kind of leaving this open all the time, and this gets very hard to manage. If I had lots of people connecting into a certain resource, maybe this is a jump box. As soon as I start adding things with public IPs, I'm not going to give a public IP to every server. What's going to be far more common if you did do this is I have a jump box VM with a public IP, which then could go and use the internal IPs to get to everything else. But managing this is difficult. This is where we get kind of the Azure Security Center standard SKU. Now add something called JIT. And what JIT is going to do, and I'll show this in a demo at the end of the video, what JIT's going to do is actually manage that NSG for me. So rather than me manually adding that internet rule, and it's just standing there all the time, what JIT will do is give me an interface that I can go to after I've set up a policy, say, hey, I want to get to that machine. And I can either give it a range of IPs, or it can detect my public-facing IP address. And then for a certain time window, it will modify the NSG to allow me access from my public-facing IP address for, let's say, 2 hours. And it will remove it from the NSG automatically. So that's what the just-in-time does. And although I'm talking about just-in-time from a public IP, I can use JIT internally as well. JIT is applying the NSG rule. So if I apply JIT to just a VM on the network, I still have to activate it before I could even communicate within the virtual network or anything else. It will always apply. So JIT is that solution. Hey, I want to give it a public IP, but I want to try and lock down, reduce my attack surface. So that just-in-time solution, that's an option, that's part of the Azure Security Center, and JIT is part of kind of the standard, so it's the paid SKU of Azure Security Center. There's another option. So the other option is something called Azure Bastion. And what the Azure Bastion service is going to do is kind of similar to this approach, but it's taking all the work away from me. What Azure Bastion is going to do is, let's just do another. If I just think about, hey, my virtual network again, this is my VNet, and I've got lots of different subnets again, and I've got subnets with my resources in. What Bastion does is it takes a certain subnet. So it takes this Azure Bastion subnet, so this is going to be my Bastion subnet. It automatically deploys a set of infrastructure. I'm not managing that. I deploy an instance of the Bastion service. It takes that subnet. It has now kind of this public-facing endpoint that I don't really see as such. I don't manage it. I don't worry about it. It's securing it. I'm not exposing VMs that can be port scanned over the internet anymore. So now what happens is I can kind of go to the Azure portal and I'd see all my kind of virtual machines. If I open up a particular VM, there's kind of that connect button. There's going to be a Bastion option. And when I click that, it's now going to open up a new blade on my browser that is a RDP or SSH connection to that virtual machine. I can integrate with Azure AD and MFA and lots of cool stuff to control that connection. But it's going to basically, from here, it's taking that connection and then jumping me to the particular resource. Now today it only works from the portal. So I can't use a regular RDP or SSH client. But if I'm just on the web and I've deployed Bastion to my virtual network, I can just click the VM, hit connect, select the Bastion tab, select the virtual machine, and I'm connected to it. The VM has no public IP address. It's just doing that pass-through for me. It's essentially acting like have you ever seen RD Gateway? It's kind of doing something similar to that, but it's just invisible to me. It's just providing that as a service, but I'm not worrying about any of the risk of a public IP address, the port scanning, the attacks on that. It's a managed service. It's giving me a way from the internet to connect into my resource. And I've got all the authentication that Azure AD brings. So that's another approach. If I'm good with accessing it via the console, sorry, via the portal, this is a great option. So step back, connecting to resources is if I'm on the virtual network. If I'm on a connected network, I can use the private IP of the resource. I could give maybe a jump box a public IP address. If I'm going to do that, I definitely want to secure it with just in time. I make a request, hey, I want to get access to it. It will update the network security group to give just my box access for a certain period of time, and then remove that access. Remembering, I could use this yes for public IPs. If I had a really important resource, even internally, I could still use JIT on it. Also, a clarifying point, I said my public IP address. If I'm sitting in Starbucks, I don't have a unique public IP address. When I enable JIT, it's for whatever gateway is in Starbucks or at the airport. So potentially, when I've enabled that, anyone else in Starbucks or sitting at the airport, they could try and attack my VM as well. Chances of that happening, I think, are pretty slim. It'd be pretty unlucky, but just bear that in mind. It's not my virtual machine. It's whatever that IP address is that is facing the internet. Other approach, Bastion. If I'm not on a connected network or I just want a really quick, easy access from the Azure portal, I can just select it once I've deployed the Bastion service, and there is a charge for this. Now I can just say, hey, Bastion connect, do MFA if I wanted it, and I'm now connected through the browser. So I hope that was useful. Let's now jump to a little demo and actually see both JIT and how it does the NSGs and Bastion in action. So to start this demonstration, I'm going to try and connect to my virtual machine. Now this virtual machine does have a public IP address and it has an associated DNS name. I'm going to just hit connect. So it's trying to connect via that public IP and it's sitting and it's waiting and ultimately it's going to fail. And there we go. So it can't get to it. And the reason is this virtual machine is protected by Azure Security Center and the just-in-time access. So if I actually scroll down, I can go to my just-in-time VM access. I have this enabled for 2 virtual machines. And right now there are 0 approved requests. Now I'll actually show you the setup of this in a second. But for right now, I'm just going to select the VM. I'm going to say I want access. And I want access from my IP address. So I'm going to set this to on. There's a certain time range this can be supported for. If I actually go over there, I can adjust that how long I need it for in hours. Because I'm kind of zoomed in funny, you're not seeing all the detail the right way, but I'll show you this later on. But I'm just going to change it. I'm going to put it all the way up to the maximum and say open the port. So notice I can enter a justification. So it's going away and it's actually going to implement that request. And by implement that request, it's going to change the network security group of the associated subnet. So it's gone away, it's initiated it. It takes maybe 20, 30 seconds. And what we can do is we can try and connect again. So let's try that connection again. May have already implemented that NSG update. It can, like I say, take about 30 seconds. We'll see if this one works. If not, we'll just try again straight away. So note that failed a little bit too quick. Try one more time. Oh, and this time it's working. So now I've connected to that virtual machine via the public IP. So now I'm connected to my virtual machine. Let's take a step back and actually look at, well, what did we do? So yes, I've got kind of my virtual machines. And this is the virtual machine I was connecting to, and it has a public IP address. Now also, it's protected as part of Security Center standard. Now what I can actually do is I go to my just-in-time VM access, and I would enable virtual machines for JIT. If I actually go ahead and look at the properties of the configuration, you can see I have added the ability to request port 3389. So that is RDP. And I've specified a time range of up to 24 hours. Now, I absolutely could delete that rule. I could add additional rules for different ports that I want. I can set what the max request time is. But remember, when I connected, I could actually change that. So if I went back to it and said I want to request access, this is where I get that little slider, and I can change the number of hours for this particular request. And the default is my IP, so it's detecting what is my public facing IP address, probably not the IP of my actual machine. Probably got some RFC 1918 at 10 or 172 something. But I have some NAT gateway at my house, at Starbucks, wherever, and that's the IP address it's going to give access to. Now, how is it doing that? Now, this virtual machine is on a virtual network. So if I actually jump over and look at my virtual networks, so I am in South Central US. And if I look at this, I have a number of subnets, and each subnet can have an NSG. And here you can see my infrastructure subnet to which this virtual machine belongs has the NSG network locked, security group attached to it. So if I selected that subnet, you can actually see I could change the NSG. I could go and get various details about that subnet. Now let's actually go ahead and look at the NSG so we can understand what it's actually doing. So if I now go and look at my network security groups, and we look at the one in South Central US, we're going to see a number of rules. Now this is the interesting part. Remember, we have the default ones, the 65,000 ones. Now as soon as I enable JIT for a particular virtual machine, the first thing it does is add these deny rules. So I have 2 VMs protected by JIT. So what it's done is for the port of the configuration, in this case RDP 3389, from anywhere to that VM, it's just denying access. So it's explicitly denying. That's going to override the normal virtual network to virtual network anything allow. So at this point, I couldn't RDP to it even from within the virtual network. Now, this is why you'll see I actually have a rule that I added which allows RDP within the virtual network. So just for 3389. And the reason I did that is I don't want to have to use JIT if I want to RDP from one VM to another VM. So I explicitly added that rule, so I only have to use JIT for kind of from the internet. Now, when I requested that access via JIT, it added this priority 100 rule. And here you can see it's enabled it from a certain source, which is my IP address of my gateway, in this case at home, to that virtual machine. Because that's a priority of 100, well, that's going to override the deny to that virtual machine from anywhere. Now, after that period of time has elapsed, that rule will get deleted. So therefore, I would lose access again. So that is JIT. Now let's look at the actual Bastion capability. Now, firstly, I have already deployed. So if I look at my Bastions, I have it deployed to South Central, and it actually goes into its own subnet within my virtual network. So here, if I look at my Bastion, you can see it's deployed to my virtual network to its own special subnet, Azure Bastion subnet. Now, once that's deployed, if I go back and just look at my virtual machine, and let's just pick any of my virtual machines that are in South Central US. Pick my domain controller. If I hit connect, it's going to give me actually a few options. Now, I have JIT enabled for this VM. So the first thing is, if I was using RDP, it gives me a hook into JIT so I could request access. But I'm not going to go via the JIT. I'm going to use my Bastion service. And here I can just say, hey, open in a new window. So I would just enter my credentials in the portal, and then I would hit connect. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to do kind of a pop-up, and it got blocked because, hey, you need to allow pop-ups. Once I actually enable pop-ups, if I try again, now it's going to open it up. I have now essentially connected via that Bastion service into the VM. And that's all there is to it. You deploy Bastion, I can go and connect from the portal, and I'm kind of good to go. Now remember, the way Bastion is working is it has resources deployed into this Azure Bastion subnet. From that subnet, it has this public facing IP as well. And then I'm connecting via that service, and it's then hopping over to the IP address, which is in a different subnet. Now, because that VM does have JIT enabled on it, the only reason it's working is because, remember, I have that explicit rule that I added to say enable RDP within the virtual network. If I go back to my network security groups, remember, I explicitly have this rule that says, hey, allow RDP within the virtual network. Let's just break it for a second just to kind of prove a point. If I now save this JIT rule is essentially now broken. It won't work because RDP doesn't use ICMP. So now I'll jump over and I'll try and connect via the portal. I'll use my Bastion service. I'll enter my credentials and hit connect. And it's trying and it's failing. The network connection to the Bastion host appears unstable. Now if I go in and I fix this rule again, I'll put it back to how it should be. Let's update that NSG. And then we'll actually try and connect again for exactly the same browser. Now I can connect. That's kind of showing me the fact that, hey, yeah, those NSGs still apply. There's nothing magical about Bastion. It's a service in a subnet. It takes the request and then it RDPs from its subnet to the resource. If I have JIT, well, I'd have to still enable the JIT to get to it. The JIT applies to both that public IP, if it has one, but also its internal IP.
So I hope that was useful. If it was, please give this video a like, share it, and subscribe. And I look forward to seeing you again on another video soon. Take care.